Wow, what a turnout. Great. What a fun evening we're going to have. Welcome. I'm Don Massaro, president of the Emeriti Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Emeritus lecture by Jim Clifford. It's going to be a great talk. We're all here, as you are, because we have a connection to this university. When I came in 1979, one of my favorite factoids was, wow, we have about a half an acre per student. Now, since that time, we've grown to nurture many more students, so maybe we're down to about an eighth of an acre. Now, one reason that we've preserved the integrity of this campus is because of Frank Sward. Frank was an undergrad here at UCSC, majoring in mathematics, went off to Princeton to study architecture, worked for a variety of firms, returned to Santa Cruz, and took on his dream job of campus architect in 1988, and he served in that capacity until 2010. And Frank's stewardship helped preserve the integrity of this university. So, Frank, would you like to introduce our speaker?
That's a great introduction, Don. Thank you.
Thank you, Dom. My introduction tonight had its beginnings nearly 6 years ago. Not far from here, as the campus was dedicating its new Digital Arts Research Center. It was a glorious spring afternoon, April 29th, 2010, a Thursday, with brilliant blue skies and tufts of puffy cumulus clouds fringing the eastern horizon. It was exactly the kind of day captured by all the photographs in every publication and every website extolling the wonders of UC Santa Cruz. The crowd was in a celebratory mood, and towards me came a pleasant-looking fellow. "Excuse me," he said, "but aren't you Frank Sward?" "Why, yes, I am," I responded, "and aren't you Jim Clifford?" And that's how I first met Jim. Our paths had never crossed, but I recognized him because he had been pointed out to me as a skilled performer of songs by the French songwriter-poet Georges Brassens. On this particular afternoon, though, Jim didn't have subversive chanson française in mind. He wanted to talk about architecture and about UCSC's architecture in particular. He had come to the right guy. I was more than happy to indulge him, and we spent a very pleasant 10 or 15 minutes talking about the campus, its buildings, and mostly its landscape. During the course of our conversation, Jim asked if an architectural campus of the history had ever been written. Not since the mid-1980s, I told him, when Virginia Jansen and Rainer Banham taught a course and mounted an exhibition on the subject. A day or two later, I sent Jim information about UCSC's early campus planning, including 2 brief memos, only 4 pages apiece, from photographer Ansel Adams and landscape architect Thomas Church, crystallizing their observations about the undeveloped Cowell Ranch site. Adams urged the university to make this remarkable site an educational experience itself. "We can," he wrote, "give these students a unique perspective into the echoes of the world from which they come, a special condition of beauty and, if you will, of spiritual therapy." Church, as a landscape architect, proposed principles to guide the design of the new campus's buildings. And architecture here must grow out of the problems, restrictions, and potentialities of the site. The buildings are less important in the visual composition than the trees. The land must remake our standard conceptions of building and plaza and parking lot. The 2 writings, particularly Tommy Church's, captured Jim's imagination. He recognized right away the tremendous accomplishment of conceiving and building on this very special, this uncommon site. Our conversation continued over the succeeding months, with fellow Emeriti Virginia Jansen and Michael Cowan joining us shortly thereafter. Our collaboration resulted in the exhibition An Uncommon Place, Shaping the UC Santa Cruz Campus, that, with Cessnan curator Shelby Graham's help, was shown at Porter College's Cessnan Gallery last spring and Cowell College's Smith Gallery last fall. Jim's irreverent humor, editorial razor, and most of all, his love of this campus were essential to our collaboration and to the show. If you didn't have a chance to see it, I'm happy to give a plug to the University Library's Digital Initiatives Department, which has mounted a digital version online. You can find it by Googling an Uncommon Place digital archive. Jim's journey to UC Santa Cruz began with a New York City childhood that included summers in Vermont and frequent excursions to the booming Greenwich Village and Washington Square scenes. From New York, it was on to Haverford College, the London School of Economics, Stanford as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, and Harvard, where after 2 years of dissertation research in Paris, he received his PhD in European intellectual and social history. His various travels put him at the center of many of, if not most, of the major 20th century intellectual trends: Marxism, British cultural studies tradition, and the world of French theory, semiotics, structuralism, and post-structuralism. His dissertation on French anthropologist and missionary Maurice Lenhart took him to the interstices of traditional academic disciplines, which he has explored ever since. With fresh PhD in hand, Jim arrived in Santa Cruz in 1978 as one of the first 2 full-time appointments in History of Conscious. The other was Hayden White. Of his arrival here, he has said, "I was a child of the 60s and reckless enough to want the adventure, and a distinguished adventure it has been. An influential teacher and scholar, he has held visiting professorships at Yale, University College London, the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris, the Free University in Berlin, and Stanford. From 1988 to 1995, he served as founding director of UCSC Center for Cultural Studies. He has published widely, including a trilogy of major books concerned with questions of travel, displacement, border crossings, indigeneity, and diaspora: The Predicament of Culture in 1988, Roots, Travel and Translation in the Late 20th Century in 1997, and Returns, Becoming Indigenous in the 21st Century in 2013. In October 2011, Jim's academic accomplishments took him back to Cambridge, Mass., where he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I like to think, at least for the purposes of this evening, that it was more than a coincidence that among his classmates in the Academy was the American troubadour Paul Simon. Who can forget Simon's 1973 classic hit, Kodachrome? They give us those nice bright colors, they give us the greens of summer, makes you think all the world's a sunny day. I got a Nikon camera, I love to take a photograph, so mama, don't take my Kodachrome away. Sadly, in 2009, Kodak did take Kodachrome away, but the digital revolution that doomed Mr. Simon's favorite film also opened up the world of photography for Jim Clifford. Jim's photographic explorations with digital camera form the basis of In the Ecotone, the UC Santa Cruz campus, a recent collection of his photographs, at least some of which I am sure we'll see tonight. One of the great pleasures of my 20-some years as campus architect was showing first-time visitors around the campus. Each tour gave me the opportunity to see this place with the eyes of a newcomer. Tonight, though, I'm delighted to be able to turn the tour over to a knowledgeable and perceptive guide. I have no doubt that we'll all see something new. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our friend and colleague, Jim Clifford.
Thank you, Frank. Great. Well, thanks so much, Frank, and thank you all for coming. And I'm very grateful, of course, to Don Massaro and the Emeriti Association for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I'd also like to acknowledge right away my friends and colleagues who've been working with me to explore the history, architecture, and aesthetics of our amazing campus. Frank Sward, Michael Cowan, and Virginia Jansen. I've learned a lot from them, and their ideas are reflected throughout what I'll be saying tonight. Frank has told you about the exhibition we curated last year. It used a lot of photographs, oral histories, and architectural plans. Frank is an amazing archivist of the architectural history of our campus, and I hope someday he writes all that up. He has a lot to tell us. Our exhibition focused on the crucial first 2 decades of UCSC's history, and we stopped in the mid-'70s when actually all the growth stopped because there was a global recession and the funding dried up. But it was during those first years of intense growth that the basic shape, the architectural and aesthetic template for our campus was established. All development since then has taken place within this basic shape. And an allied exhibition curated by Richard Wohlfeiler, Irene Reddy, and me gathered old and new campus photographs at that time by professional and amateur photographers. We called it Rhythms of Place. Juxtaposed images revealed something of the embodied experience, the phenomenology, if you will, of a complex social and natural environment. Rhythms of Place could be a title for the first part of my talk tonight. I'll be drawing on all of these collaborations and on 15 years of photographing the campus to explore, all too briefly, 3 general areas. The first, the embodied experience of our campus, or perhaps following Gaston Bachelard, its Poetics of Space. Here I'll consider light, shape, distance, and movement. I'll try to give substance to an aesthetics that's more than just the conventional language of beauty or of the sublime. You know, it's so beautiful. Oh, it's so awesome. An aesthetics that engages with our sensual perceptions and at times our dreamlike experiences. In the second section, I'll trace a little history of the built environment, asking how the campus got to be the way it is. We'll meet a few of the practical visionaries who were decisive in shaping the built environment here. And finally, I'll speculate briefly about the legacy and the ongoing, even utopian significance of our unusual, perhaps unique experiment in educational and environmental cohabitation. The unifying thread is my personal discovery of the Santa Cruz campus. I'm not an expert, I hasten to add, about the many areas that could be relevant: architecture, natural history, different segments of the university, for example, the farm, the arboretum, the coastal campus, all places that I'll have to neglect tonight. This is participant observation by an amateur. And since most of you have your own direct experience of my topic, I'm particularly looking forward to your comments following the talk. Like so many of us, when I arrived here, that was in 1978, I was astonished by the place. But quickly, the work routine took over, and I came to perceive the campus in repetitious ways, to frequent the same places, to follow the same paths. But when I began to carry a digital camera with me around the year 2000, things changed. I noticed complexity, different lights, vistas, forms, color palettes, transitions. I began to depart from my well-worn paths. I made a lot of photographs. You've been looking here at one of the first I took, one of the images that opened my eyes. This was a shot just a few feet off the path from an unfamiliar angle. This, of course, is the bridge between Hahn and the library, the first and only all-wooden bridge we have on campus. And seeing it from this unfamiliar angle, I shot the picture and discovered a hidden world below the bridge I'd walked over so often. Well, the bridge's wonderful wooden structure, saturated colors, not digitally enhanced, I swear, the fog burning off and making a special light. Last fall, I published a selection of the images I've collected over the years, along with several essays, in a book called In the Ecotone. Richard Wohlfeiler, a terrific artist and technical genius, designed the book, so it looks great. Ecotone, as I hope will emerge throughout my remarks tonight, is a term for a transition zone between ecologies, a site of juxtapositions, alternations, dynamic relationships. I'll project many of the book's photos tonight, along with others, and my remarks will draw on the 3 essays it contains. Bay Tree Bookstore is stocking in the Ecotone, along with the Literary Guillotine and Bookshop Santa Cruz downtown. It's available tonight in the lobby, along with other works on the campus and its history. These include the excellent natural history, of course, and the wonderfully weird unnatural history. I should also mention Bill Doyle's useful historical accounts and the Cowell Lime Works project, a fascinating book that's all about cement, lime kiln legacies. We should all be grateful to Bay Tree for keeping these works available. You'll find them all in there, hiding in plain sight among all the hoodies and slug paraphernalia. I'd also like to call your attention to a remarkable project currently sponsored by the Institute for the Arts and Sciences, Collective Museum. Go to the Institute's website for details, and then over the next few years, discover the 50 sites scattered around the campus, each of which secretes a provocative history. Look for the sky blue signs and links for your smartphone. Here's Frank explaining the site and story he contributed, just downhill from the team in lecture hall. It's about the so-called vertical architectural element contained in the early campus plans, a tower of some sort that, thankfully, never peeked out over the trees on Science Hill. The collective museum exhibitions at Porter Cessnon, the Allied exhibition at the gallery, closes this coming Saturday, so if you haven't been, you have time. The gallery's open 12 to 5 and late until 8 p.m. tomorrow and Thursday nights. All of these resources, along with the rich online oral history collection at McHenry Library, so brilliantly curated by Irene Reddy, gives us a lot to work with as we explore different perspectives on our complex campus. Oh, and speaking of the library, I'd like to take this occasion to welcome Teresa Mora, our new university archivist, who's with us tonight, sitting next to Michael Cowan over there. She's looking forward to working with many of you to collect and organize UCSC's history. Okay, my first section, call it aesthetics. Here's another early image, taken the same day as the first. My camera's lens and digital sensor still in love with the rain and fog. It's the path from performing arts down to Oaks. When History of Consciousness was based in Oaks College, I walked it many times and never tired of its changing moods. You really can't get to know this place if you only get around by car or bus. It's all about walking. And I don't mean serious hiking. Even a short detour off the road or a slow stroll on a footbridge can be incredibly interesting. Walking lets you notice the alternating scenes, constant shifts between light and shadow, deep down and high up, close and distant, horizontal and vertical, built and unbuilt. There's nothing smooth or continuous about this site. I've come to understand that the place structures our experience through abrupt transitions, dynamic oppositions, that, for me at least, sometimes take on the quality of dreams. I'm trying to show this with images tonight, but the aesthetic I'm reaching for can't be primarily visual, not a sequence of pictures. I'm returning the word, trying to return it, the word aesthetic, to an older, pre-Kantian set of meanings, less about beauty than about a full range of embodied experiences. Let's begin with the alternation of light and shadow. Or this. As you walk, the light is always changing. Dappled light in the forest. It's a lot harder to photograph than fog, as any photographer knows. The camera can't process different lights at the same time, but our eyes and brain do an excellent job. Often you're walking among trees, and as you emerge from the shadows, a building suddenly appears behind the ever-present screen. From place to place, day to day, season to season, different light environments. Or this. Another fundamental contrast that structures our experience is movement, the swing between feeling deep down and feeling high up. This is an early shot for me, not the best quality because I was using a pretty basic Olympus point-and-shoot camera back then, but it captures, for me at least, the dreamlike state, floating among the trees, neither up nor down, or both and. And the dramatic unevenness of the campus site, the deep ravines cutting through. And you can explore, I found, the worlds down below with a little bit of scrambling. It's wild sometimes, or sensuously carpeted. Heterotopic places down there, apart, but very much integral to the built environment. All the seen infrastructure, all the unseen, usually unseen infrastructure. You can get here by just walking 50 yards uphill up into the forest from the village in the lower quarry. Up above these places, in our everyday rushing from place to place, we tend to flatten the landscape. That's the practical function of the footbridges, after all. The bridge's more complex aesthetic effects, feelings of simultaneous depth and altitude, those kick in once we slow down. Two-dimensional maps aren't much help experiencing the place. Even ones like this one that add a time dimension, walking times, Oaks to Merrill, 23 minutes, and all of it uphill. On a map, you can't see the ravines, the knolls, the slopes. When we orient ourselves cartographically, we project an abstract level ground, as if viewed from above, and we forget where we really are. Perhaps the most fundamental alternation on this campus is between feelings of being deep inside and high above. You're lost in the woods, enclosed. And then, not far away, you're on a high hill. The campus paths twist and turn, dip and rise, without a way to see very far ahead. Those little white globes are like, I've come to see them as discrete guides, just a little ways ahead. You can see a couple of them there. Well, and then the curtain parts, and you're back on that high hill. It's very hard to photograph the bay view, I've found. It's too big, too flat, too empty. Most of the time, that is. Clouds saturated with rain help. There needs to be some form to the sky to make it cohere as a visual image. And the space of the bay surrounds us. This is, of course, a limitation of all the images I'm showing, the way they put frames around experience. Heidegger, the philosopher, called this reduced attitude toward being the world picture. We've all had the experience, haven't we, of driving off campus after a day's work and suddenly seeing that view. Sometimes I just have to pull over and be there. It's not a picture, it's not a postcard, it's not wallpaper, it's real, and you're inside it. And the sun is slanting across from the right, and if it's clear, you can see all the way to the northern mountains of Big Sur. And while we're talking about Monterey Bay, Moss Landing. Some of you will know, I think I've said this to a number of you already, will remember our colleague Rainer Banham's bon mot about this. Banham, the great historian of design and architecture, who taught here for a number of years, and would ride his bike down the bike path, and he used to say, he was a witty Englishman, I ride my bike down the bike path each day, and I spend my time ranking Monterey Bay among the world's great west-facing bays. And he would say, I make it number 2. Only, he says, only because Moss Landing, which in those days used to regularly put up a plume of white smoke, only because Moss Landing is a rather poor substitute for Vesuvius. I really miss Peter Banham, as I know a number of you others do too. Another way of thinking about the structured experience of our campus is the alternation between perception at a distance and up close. We're constantly forced to change focus as we walk on these paths. There's always obstruction, things hidden and revealed. It's virtually impossible to photograph any building as a whole, as a complete shape. This is Han. Can you see it? The structures often seem to be invaded by the trees. They're embedded close up in the environment. This effect is the result of deliberate planning decisions, the relation of structure to tree, a kind of architectural ecology, as we'll see in a moment. For now, thinking aesthetically, we notice the shifting perspectives. Performing arts. Up close, the fire-charred stumps. And the Pacific, looking west, or almost west, from the Oaks remote parking lot. One more formal structure that for me defines the place contrasts strong vertical and horizontal elements. We felt the depth of the ravines and the expanse of the ocean, but also redwoods from below. The redwoods, all verticality, drawing us upward, and very hard to photograph. Or the horizontal live oaks, growing sideways, earthbound. I could show you countless other images to make this point. The oaks are very photogenic, but I'll spare you. My general proposal about the spatial and perceptual complexity of our campus must be clear by now. This is a place where the cartographic impulse, the desire for overview, for continuous, smooth perspective, is continuously frustrated. All navigation here is bumpy, embodied, and point to point, like walking. It's never straight. Nothing but curving, sloping paths. In the central campus environment, there's no place from where you can look down on the scene or see very far. But when you do arrive at the edge of the ecotone, the transition from forest to grassland, suddenly you seem to see forever. And if you walk in the meadow, another world, down close, appears. If I were a botanist and ecologist, like our colleague Ingrid Parker, I'd have a lot to say about this world. Well, before I move on to a little history, I should mention, if only in passing, the other creatures who live and work here. Someone is looking at us. And if your Zoom is effective, as mine was that morning, The critters all around see us. We usually don't see them. In 1965, a new population moved in, almost dropped from the sky like extraterrestrials in this clever photo staged by local Santa Cruz photographer Vester Dick. The much reproduced image has been said to express the boldness, enthusiasm, and a certain whimsy that animated UCSC's pioneers. And so it does. It's also a somewhat troubling image of disconnection, of innocent occupiers in an empty space, a place without history or other inhabitants. Of course, the Cowell Ranch had long been a changed and changing site. When the new creatures arrived, denizens of the ecotone would have to learn how to live together, to live and let live. I found some help in thinking about this from my colleague Donna Haraway's oral history in the library collection. UCSC is like a species assemblage, she says. I think universities are like edge areas in ecology where different habitat assemblages intermix, like ecotones where all the species are, in a sense, outside their comfort zone, but they can still make a living well enough to be there. And new things are happening in these ecotones. New things like a university. I ran with some of Donna's ideas in my book, conceiving the campus as nothing but transitions, edges, and relations. Tonight, I just have time to offer a glimpse of a complex and always changing environment. Now I'd like to say something about the architectural strategies of the early planners, the key decisions that gave us the environment we know today. How did the campus get to be the way it is? Here's the Cowell Ranch site around 1960. Before the university arrived, we featured it in our exhibition. And more than any other image I've seen, it shows the contours of the land, the wooded ravines reaching down through the meadows, and the dense redwood forest above. I think we can see a few recognizable points. This is the Great Meadow. Right here is where we are at this moment. This is the meadow, of course, with the east remote lot and the playing fields and so forth. Stevenson and Cowell are up here in the woods. Oh, that's Poganip down there. Somebody told me, Barbara Lawrence told me, oh yes, she said, that was our faculty club in the first years when the first colleges were being constructed. And Porter College is more or less here. This is the 420 Meadow. You get the scene. An astonishing sight, really. On this much transformed site, worked by Indians, loggers, ranchers, lime producers, anything but pristine nature, a new UC Research University was to be built. In the late 1960s, California was booming. The unprecedented post-war capitalist expansion had not yet stalled. That meant that if the state governor wanted 3 new campuses, he built them. Well, all that would change, but not before UCSC was well established here, Santa Cruz having prevailed over a rival site in San Jose. UCSC turned out the way it did because of economic pressures and political maneuvering, because it was jaw-dropping beautiful, and because of an innovative educational agenda. It did not take the form it did in order to suppress dissent. That legend dies hard. Almost everyone I talk with knows that UCSC's decentered campus was dictated by a desire to avoid student demonstrations. No rallying place like Sproul Hall in Berkeley. Or maybe it was a strategy hatched by Ronald Reagan. In fact, the basic plans for UCSC preceded by nearly 2 years the free speech movement of December '64. And Reagan was elected governor in 1966, a year after the campus opened. An experimental university at Santa Cruz was originally conceived as a response to what Mario Savio would later denounce on Sproul Hall steps, the impersonal, soulless mega-university where students felt like cogs in a machine. Clark Kerr and his longtime friend, Dean McHenry, recognized the problem and imagined a new kind of research university, a place that would, as they put it, grow large while feeling small. Separate, human-scale colleges were to be the answer. Once it was decided to build among the ravines and redwoods, there was simply no way to construct a physically centered campus. Moreover, the physical separation imposed by the terrain and vegetation was seen by educational planners like Clark Kerr as an advantage, supporting his vision of semi-autonomous colleges. The decisive choice about where to build was taken around 1962. The new campus would not be centered in the open fields of the Cowell Ranch as originally planned, but in the forest above. Let me introduce three individuals who were key players, in addition, of course, to the more familiar figures like Kerr and McHenry. Jack Wagstaff, campus architect, UCSC's very first employee, even before McHenry was hired. He managed and facilitated all the building and spatial planning of the university's first decades. Regent Eleanor Heller, pictured here, July 19, 1962, on a campus visit with, left to right, Regent Gerald Hager, architect John Carl Warneke, Regent Donald McLaughlin, and we see where our campus roads get their names, some of them, and Chancellor Dean McHenry. Regent Heller was an important voice on UCSC's initial campus planning committee. And a good liberal, Ronald Reagan tried to get her out of her position, and she was one of 6 regents who voted against firing Angela Davis down at UCLA. Good for her. And Eleanor Heller later became the first female chairman of the Board of Regents. Oh, note these convertibles loaned by a local car dealer for the distinguished visitors, driven up the dirt ranch road to the top of the meadow, luckily always in good weather. And the hero of my story, Thomas Church, known by all his friends as Tommy. Church was the consulting landscape architect for our campus during its first decades, that and a good deal more. Who was Tommy Church? Well, he was very famous among landscape architects in the 1950s and 60s. He collaborated with the distinguished architect William Worcester, creating the California style of ranch house and landscape, the kind of thing that became canonized in publications like Sunset Magazine in the 50s. By the way, the creation of the ranch house and this landscaping has our area played an important part. Everyone agrees the first ranch house designed by Worcester is in Scotts Valley. It's the Gregory farmhouse in Scotts Valley, plain and unadorned, porches, lots of doors. And the important Pasatiempo collaboration of Worcester and Church from the 30s, which really established their reputation. Church's style of garden construction, well, it was inspired by North Italy and the Moorish Andalusia. It featured indoor-outdoor flow. Gardens were to live in, not to view or walk through. Church had an anti-formal perspective. He was not about building formal French gardens or things like that. He was respectful of topography and flora. He tried to keep as many trees as he could. There was the use of decks, lawns, and contoured swimming pools. By the 1950s, he was the most sought-after garden designer in Northern California. He worked for many of the regents, including Eleanor Heller, with whom he formed a close alliance. Oh yeah, notice his boots and the trademark floppy hat. No Cadillacs for him. He walked the site. He worked outside. Church had a house in Pasatiempo, and he knew the Cowell Ranch land very well. If the university were to be in the Meadow, there would have been a conventional campus plan. We showed some of these plans in our exhibition. If in the forest, something very different. Something different and more expensive. Church, seconded by Heller, made the case. Skeptical regions had to be won over. Eleanor Heller recalled that the Southern California regions especially were skeptical, and not just for budgetary reasons. They liked flat land. She thought they didn't understand forests the way we Northerners do. Well, Church was inspiring. He had quiet authority, plus prestige and social connections. Eventually, he convinced everyone, and especially Kerr and McHenry. Building a university in the forested transition zone, a rugged terrain traversed by deep ravines, would certainly be a challenge. But how much more interesting than a cookie-cutter campus laid down in the fields? And Church asked, weren't the open meadows, the vast views, and the ranch ambience essential elements, a signature of the site? Wagsta, the campus architect, was in agreement. He worked closely with Church, and he translated his senior partner's vision into practice as the campus grew. It's been a lot of fun for me to try and imagine the place before there were any paved roads or organized pathways here. How would you know where to put the buildings? You couldn't do it with aerial photography, given all the tree cover. This must be something like what passed for a road on the Cowell Ranch in 1963. In an oral history, Jack Wagstaff recalls what planning, from the ground up, not in an architect's office, was like. He and Tommy Church tramping around in the fog. I quote, this is Wagstaff. The Santa Cruz campus is composed of knolls and arroyos, and then more knolls, and the buildable sites are in the minority, really, because the central part of the campus is so rugged. The sites had to be pretty carefully selected, and one knoll relating to the next, and those knolls in turn related to the functions of what went on. I remember Tommy and I wandering around one foggy, wet day and discovering where the library was to be sited, on a beautiful knoll within a bowl. It's fun to imagine that morning, at least it is for me. Just remove in your mind the chairs, the stairs, and the railing. Well, here's a map that may help give us a little better sense of the terrain. This is a topographic map that was drawn by Lawrence Halprin, the famous landscape designer and visionary. Many of you may know his Sea Ranch project north of San Francisco, and many others. Well, Halprin was one of the landscape architects of the early campus, and he had worked with Church, as pretty much everyone had in one way or another. Well, here you can see you can sort of see the campus. I mean, excuse me, I'm pushing the wrong button. Here we are. Here's this is one, the number one is in there somewhere. This is what will be Cowell, this is what will be Stevenson, this is what will be Crown. They're just sort of imaginary renderings at that point. The only real building that existed was the field house, which for the first year was the university, as you might know, along with the trailers in the mud. But moving out this way, we have, this is Hahn. It's under construction, I guess. And here's a dotted line that says where the library is going to be. Up here, some vague senses of the science hill, social science, the humanities over here. That never happened. Administration, right where we're sitting now, more or less, a long curving building looking out over the great meadow, never built. We've got maybe a little better sense zooming in a little bit. And we can see the knolls on which things were built. I mean, the library, as you can see, the land falls away on all of these sides and then only goes uphill in this one area toward Science Hill. I didn't really know what a knoll was before I got into this. I sort of knew, but it's sort of like a three-sided hill or something like that, And And all you have to do to experience it is to walk out of any college on this campus, and within 50 yards, you're going downhill. And then you'll see how that is. But you know, of course, we flattened it in our mind, in our cartographic mind. But it ain't flat. And this is the knoll on which Han is built. The lecture hall, which is imagined over here, eventually got built over here. This is where the bookstore is and so forth. Well, I mean, to me, this topographic map really showed me in a very direct way just how rugged this landscape was. Oh, and if all this wasn't complex enough, there was the subterranean campus. The limestone formations, or karst underground, this porous, easily fragmented, cavernous underground world that produced sinkholes in all sorts of inconvenient places. This one was right under where they wanted to build the Applied Sciences building, now Baskin Engineering. And here's a sinkhole that's still there right next to that building. Well, I'd like to introduce you to what Wagsta has called the aesthetic charter for our campus. Frank read you a little piece of it in his introduction. In 1962, just as the long-range development plan was being drafted, Thomas Church wrote an influential memo. It was actually dashed off on a transcontinental airplane trip. Random notes on the UC Santa Cruz campus. His message was directed to the team of architects who would design the first colleges and core buildings. The full 4-page text is in my book. It was instantly persuasive, circulated to the regents, quoted in the LRDP, and included in the packet given to all architects building at UCSC for at least a decade or two. I think we were very lucky to have had a landscape architect as our planning guru. Usually the architecture comes first, the landscaper then is brought in to make it prettier, to hide the faults. Church began with the site. He began with the trees. In the memo, he admonished the architects, don't compete with the redwoods. They will win in any event. He urged a guiding sense of scale and relationship to surroundings. There would be no extensive grading and clearing. Church eloquently evoked an architecture that could collaborate with its surroundings. I'll just read you his concluding sentences. With the exception of areas especially preserved in their natural state, the general effect in the main campus must be one of sensitive collaboration between the designer and this spectacular environment, with the intent that neither shall impose unduly upon the other. The wall-to-wall forest carpet will disappear, and in its place must come not the asphalt jungle, nor the standard campus we have always known, not an automobile under every redwood, but a vast area in which to live and study. It must be magnificent in conception, daring and forthright in its architecture, but gentle be the hand it lays upon the land. So what was built in those frantic first 13 years before the money dried up and growth stopped for a decade? Well, quite a lot was built. 7 colleges, a dozen large core buildings, and various smaller service structures, not to mention the miles of sewers and electrical conduit, all in 13 years. The core area of the campus was intended to be more formal in style, and the architects, Church and the others, were definitely wary of having anything resembling the woodsy style. If you build in a forest, like the Bohemian Grove or Camp Curry or some hunting lodge. In the core structures, dignified, large, would be built of concrete. And this was seen as a native material, a nod to the local lime industry. Large structures with fluted pillars, imposing, but masked by nearby trees, and with a height limit. No building could be higher than about 2/3 of the nearest large redwood. Oh, and we had our brutalist examples. This is applied sciences. I'm actually quite fond of, I'm not opposed to brutalism the way many people are. But it's enormous and very, very, it's enormous, but hidden. You can drive past and not even notice it. The colleges were to be more informal in style. The styles would vary. There was no uniform architectural template imposed. This is just my love affair with the beautiful cowl rooflines. Details like this that are now too expensive. The colleges are all different, from Kresge's postmodern bravura to Oaks College, crouching on its hillside. Thomas Church commented on the campus not long after its opening. He composed a dedication on the flyleaf of his popular book, Gardens or for People, when he donated a copy to the newly opened campus library. Frank Sward discovered a photocopy of the inscription somewhere. The book itself seems to have vanished. Church wrote, quote, "This campus must become famous for its voids rather than its solids. Long after this library is admired for its architecture, we will be grateful for the airspace that has been preserved inside and outside of this structure." Church was certainly referring to the library's wonderful high courtyard. But I think he was also thinking about the formative decision to leave the Meadow open, and in the same spirit of all the unbuilt spaces on campus. Void doesn't necessarily mean empty. Today, more than 60% of the campus acreage is off limits for construction, left alone for wildlife and natural history research. Church's airspace. For a place with so many trees, we have extraordinary access to the sky, with its own kinds of architecture and dramatic moods. Thomas Church was an advocate of restraint. By building with tact in his tradition and leaving a great deal untouched, we give the place breathing room, and we allow conviviality in the ecotone. Now my last section, call it Utopia. That's the student garden up at Kresge. We all recall the founding vision of a radically different UCSC and how that has been compromised. Changes, for the worse and for better. It's not my topic tonight to weigh this history, the demotion of the interdisciplinary colleges, the decline of the educational vision condensed in the narrative evaluations, the relentless increase in class size, and a growing pressure to train for a narrow range of careers. Against this, many exciting research innovations from all the divisions, a record of service to a growing state, and the dramatic, if still uneven, growth of gender and racial diversity on campus. More widely, I think we all recognize the sad trajectory of underfunded public education in our state, the abandonment of the California Master Plan. However one weighs an inescapably ambivalent history, the very existence of our campus is, I think, something to be grateful for. Simply put, we didn't wreck the place. It would have been so easy. 17,000 plus students, a lot of big structures, a lot of traffic. Yet UCSC is still a magical and ecologically varied site. The basic campus plan and philosophy have come through it all. We need to understand and defend this legacy. and to be grateful to those from Church and Wagstaff through Frank Sward, Dean Fitch and John Barnes in the Office of Physical Planning and Construction, who, through budget boom and bust, have struggled to keep the faith. No doubt there are others I should have named. Of course, we all have developments we regret, but overall, I think we've done right by the place. A modest utopian conclusion is perhaps appropriate. So I'll skip my short list of eyesores and just show a couple of recent structures on campus that I admire. The Core West parking structure. How many trees were spared by building this three-dimensional structure on an existing lot, masked by foliage? And what an inventive design. Its cantilevered sides, the feeling of parking in a treehouse. You can access my full eulogy on the Collective Museum website. And the new hay barn, the old new hay barn, a local history made new. Salvaged timbers from the old barn and new beams artfully joined. I've come to believe that the campus carries forward a radical impulse from UCSC's founding years. Am I just whistling in the neoliberal wind? Perhaps. But we have to keep utopian alternatives alive somehow. What is the inspiring vision, then, preserved in our campus? It will be different for each of us, but for me, 5 points to conclude. 1, the ecological values of restraint, relationality, and a sense of scale. Churches' voids, leaving things alone, not filling up the space or smoothing things over. Plants and animals not seen as decor, natural landscape, but as inhabitants in the shared ecotone, beings with their own needs and histories. An aesthetic sense, this is 4, an aesthetic sense that can't be reduced to a world picture, that resists flattening an overview, that calls out many different lights and angles, that forces us to be on the move, to change perspective. And 5, when we're not in a hurry, when we're paying attention, we can discover around us a dynamic place that's neither nature nor civilization, but a process of coexistence and collaboration. Well, this is some of what I've been learning as I've walked on the paths and out in the meadows. I hope you do the same and make your own discoveries. Thank you. Well,
Jim is looking forward to your questions, and there's also refreshments in the lobby. So please, Jim, you can,
okay, if
maybe
you want,
we can turn the lights up a little bit. And
Turn
do we
them up.
have microphones?
Yeah. We won't keep you too long from the refreshments and the schmoozing, but I do think, questions are fine, but I'd like it if, you all have experience of this place and you all have things to say about it that may or may not be direct responses to what I've said. So let's hear a few. Carolyn. Wait, I think they're going to bring the mic around.
Thanks. I actually have a question. So I liked what you said about, and I didn't know most of what you had to say, so it's great, about the formal versus the informal.
Yeah.
But what I'm wondering about is the first bookstore and that restaurant, which is as
the whole
cliched as you
right.
can get
Right.
for a farm or a forest.
Well, I'm glad you said this, and Virginia Jansen would have a good deal to say about this, because when we were she always insisted that this formal, informal, the concrete center, the da-da-da, that there was a third element, which was, when I said that they avoided the woodsy look, not entirely. I mean, there's a California, what would we call it? How would the style be?
Northern California tradition.
Yeah, Northern California traditional style is represented on the campus, not by a lot of buildings, but by those. Certainly by the Whole Earth and the bookstore. There's that wonderful studio on the hillside down behind Cowell. There's the radio station up the hill, things like that. They are scattered around, and that is part of it. They weren't doctrinaire. One thing I like about the planning of this campus, as opposed, say, to Stanford University, a totalitarian vision, if there ever was one, is that they had a plan, they had a general plan, they generally kept to it, but they didn't, they were willing to break their rules, and they encouraged real diversity. Yeah.
Yeah, I was a student here in the 70s, and I certainly appreciate your whole history. I'm curious, though, to hear your feelings about the evolution. Because as the campus is growing in population, it's like a microcosm of what's happening in the world. And we have to start thinking in terms of renewing our resources and using alternative energy and alternative farming and alternative water use. And all those things are not sort of part of the vision that the campus isn't evolving. It's like a historical structure that represents what we thought in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. What are your feelings about that?
Well, everything you say, I would say amen to. How could we not be trying to think that way? And we're better than a place like UCSC to do that kind of thing. And I think many people are thinking, environmentally in this kind of way. Thinking about it in terms of development is interesting, and I haven't really done that. But actually, I'm not sure how. I mean, the first planners. This was all done before Earth Day. I mean, Earth Day came, and anyone remember the date? 70-something, right? And Santa Cruz was one of the places where Earth Day happened. And the Whole Earth Restaurant and the Chadwick Garden, that was all part of that world. And Stuart Brand came down, and there was this, we were on board with that. Before that, Thomas Church, who I think had something like an ecological vision, but he didn't get it from the sources that we now would think to go to. I mean, he got it from building styles in Andalusia, things like that. I mean, he was an old-fashioned traditional guy, and I was sort of almost celebrating the California Ranch House in Sunset Magazine. Well, it was something about being more in scale with the environment. It was something about getting down low and working with the land. I mean, that was an attitude that was coming in the 60s, and a notion of environmental architecture was in the air. These ideas were not, unique to him. Lawrence Halpern, people like that, and many of the architects who were attracted to this, who were hired here. So that was all happening, but it was pre the kind of ecological thinking that we now take for granted, and that we now work with. And tracing that evolution and how that earlier sense of environmentalism, if you can call it that, morphed into the later one, would be really interesting. I can't do it. It just follows from your question. Yeah. Oh, here's Wendy. Okay. Oh, my age mate in
I know.
She came in 78 too.
Exactly. Still
Wendy
here.
Martinez.
Jim, all this tin. What's going on with all this tin?
Oh, right now?
Yeah, the tin, social sciences
Ask
too.
him.
I'm so interested in that because it really has been
Corrugated metal, you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
Cheap.
That's what I was trying to say. Yes.
Well, these are.
There's a lot of it going around here, and I'm just so interested in it.
It's cheap. That's one thing. The budgets have gone through the floor.
That's part of the answer. The budgetary restraints on things like, I know Dave Klieger always wondered why the same siding material was used on the physical sciences building as on colleges 9 and 10, the corrugated metal. The answer to that is what Jim gave. But there are other metal buildings on campus the architects recommended it for different reasons. For example, the bookstore complex, which was designed by Esherick, Holmesy, Dodge, and Davis architects who did Stevenson College and have worked on the campus for years, given that that was the entrance to the quarry, they felt that a rugged metal-clad building was the appropriate site for that. The Humanities Building, very different architect, Tom Hacker, they carefully picked a metal siding, again, for reasons of economy, but also for appearance. If you take a look at it at different times of the day under different lighting conditions, it reflects light in very different ways. So cheap is one of the answers, but each building has its own logic on its site that the architect uses to make that recommendation. Digital arts is actually wood. That's actually stained wood siding. So
how about Jerry New over there? He's been around for...
I'm actually curious to hear at least a few of your list of what you referred to as eyesores.
I thought someone would ask me that.
And it's really for a specific reason. That is, sometimes to understand the structure of a crystal, the best thing to do is to look at the cracks where it fails. Just to give two examples off the top of my head. The building we're in is a concrete bunker with no windows on what would otherwise be a $1 million view site over the Great Meadow. Or you referred to your attachment to the roof lines at Cowell. And it used to be that when you drove up to campus, you would see the cupola, and actually that was in one of the images you projected. Today, you see two white cereal boxes. How do you think things have gone wrong? And maybe a couple of examples would help.
Oh, well, yeah, there are things that I don't like. So what are some of them? I actually like this building. I like bunkers. I especially like really interestingly shaped bunkers like this one, and I like the low lines of it all. But you know, the view is very accessible here. You don't have to walk far. It's just a few steps out to have if you want to look at the view. So it doesn't bother me. I know there was a lot of hand-wringing when anything was built on this site, but I don't think it really encroaches on the Great Meadow in a serious way. That said, what don't I like? Well, I don't like the Stevenson addition, partly by contrast to the Cowell, because it has no roof line. Maybe they were trying to distinguish themselves from Cowell. But it does look like, you know, Malvina Reynolds' little boxes over there, and it's a very, very visible and, you know, piece of architecture hanging out there over the playing fields. And let's see, there are various, we've had some buildings that are, you know, not that exciting. I don't think most of them are horrible. I go to other campuses, I go to UC San Diego, and I see horrible buildings. If you want to see how to wreck a good site, go to UC San Diego, and you'll see what we avoided. Well, if you want, but just so, I don't want to become a campus scold, you know, but I'll tell you what, one thing I don't like right now is the tendency to scatter banners all over the campus with banal slogans on them. That seems to me, I would like the development people have to cease and desist in this area. So if anyone wants to start a petition, I will be happy to sign. Yeah. Hi.
Me?
Please.
Yeah, I was thinking, I really enjoyed your talk, but I was thinking of a piece that Wendell Berry wrote about 6 or 7 years ago called Inverting the Economic Order. And he talks about 4 economies: the consumer economy, the manufacturing economy, the agricultural economy, and the nature economy. And those are listed in the order which we now experience for the most part. Wendell Berry would like to put the nature economy first. It seems to me that that is something that was accomplished by Church and McHenry and other people on this campus. They put the nature economy first, and lo and behold, it's a success. Because people like to be in the nature, they like to be here, and so they stay here, and they interact with it, the deer and the coyotes and the bobcats and so on. It's very nice. So,
Well,
I was wondering, did you know about this inverting the economic order piece?
I've heard that, Peter. Thank you. You know, we won't quibble over what we mean by nature and the fact that there's nothing like real nature on this industrial cow ranch site, you know, logged over and et cetera. So but it's certainly true that church, I don't know about putting nature first in the Wendell Berry sense, but nature was a major partner in church's view with culture or civilization or the university. It had to be an equal partner. And as he said in that passage I read, none should be allowed to impose on the other. Some sort of real balance, tense balance, was what he knew we could do. And I think that's really, this is not about preserving pristine nature. That was the way people like Ansel Adams tended to think about it. Church did not think that way. He thought as a garden. Gardens are for people. Gardens are places to live and work. And so I think that because he knew they were building a university. Remember, 29,000 students. You can't move that into a forest and not change it. But you can do it in such a way that a balance is maintained. And I think that's really the achievement of Church and his successors. And we more or less are still, I think, doing it. Of course, things are being changed. Of course, there's destruction. How could there not be? But it could have been so much worse. And it's still a magical place, I think. It still feels like, and this is the utopian dimension for me, you can't be up here, and not feel you're in a special place. And at times saying, well, we should be doing something different up here. We should be thinking differently. I think the place elicits that in its denizens. And that is a utopian seed that co-constructed landscape still gives to us. So thank you for that. Oh gosh, many. What? So, yeah. Hi.
Hi, Jim. So
Dan.
we talked about Andalusia and we talked about Italy and the Mediterranean. I think those are natural associations for coastal California. But my whole aesthetic association here runs in a different direction. I wonder if anyone had anything to say about this. Even looking at this, looking at what you have up here, right? I mean, we've got the Pacific Ocean. If you shift the view a little bit, Japan is a long way off in the other direction. And
It's actually over there.
yeah, that's right, over that way. But it's across that huge body of water. And one of the associations I often have on campus is with Japanese aesthetic, and especially in talking about restraint, balance, melding of nature and human endeavors, and the coexistence with these creatures and flora in the same environment without anyone dominating that environment. That strikes me as that has a lot of resonance for me with Japanese aesthetic, and I wonder if that played any part at all in anything that you ever saw about thinking about this campus. The scale is obviously much bigger than you typically find in Japan, but so much about the campus really is evocative in that way. And even thinking about the roof lines, for example.
That's definitely an Oriental reference for me, but I actually can't answer that. But I don't remember in the documents that I've read a lot of appeals to Japan and the Orient, which is kind of strange, surprising in a way, but it really wasn't. You have to remember the faculty came from the East Coast. There's the Oxbridge kind of identification early on. Page Smith, he was tweed jackets with leather stuff. The History of Consciousness program, which is founded by Page Smith and Albert Hofstadter and people like that, they were all identified with Germany. It sounds better in German. His Geistesgeschichte, they were Hegelians. And so that was where the campus really looked that way. Interesting, though. Very interesting. Why?
I'm sorry to break this
Carl,
up, but
yeah.
maybe we could have
Yeah, that's what we said. Oh, who's up?
Jim?
Carl? Is that Carl? Who is that?
Yeah, great. This, Jim?
I'm Hal Hyde, and I wish to comment, one comment about Thomas Church.
Yeah.
He developed this later in his time here. I first knew him when I came on campus with Jack Wagstaff, and he became an almost reverence about this ecotone line, the place where there's a big change between the prairies, the open lands, and the forest. And he noted that each of the architects that were hired for the library, for central services, for the gymnasiums, all picked the ecotone line as a place to build. And he began cogitating about this and eventually said, "It's getting too crowded. Don't screw it up. Either build all the way out into the meadow or all the way up into the forest, and be careful." And that, the latter part of the 70s, then began to make the campus into those particular areas. And in comment of the last one on the Oriental side, I particularly remember Professor Obata from Berkeley being invited down by Chancellor McHenry, and particularly looking at the area around the theater area and into the Glen. And that walk with Dean McHenry and Professor Obata was the start of the Glen and that particular part of it as one specific of the Oriental side. Thank you.
Well, for those of you who don't know, that was Hal Hyde, who was really one of the founding people on the campus, our first chancellor for business, but it wasn't just business. He had his hand in building everything in the early years in the campus. But before the campus was even here, when Santa Cruz was battling it out with San Jose, Hal Hyde was instrumental in the politicking, in the connections. Hal's connections both here in Santa Cruz, but in Berkeley and in Sacramento, in getting the regions actually to change their mind, to lean away from San Jose toward Santa Cruz. I mean, really, there's hardly anything in the early years of this campus that Hal Hyde was not involved with. So that was a wonderful memory. I really appreciate hearing. So shall we say one more?
Okay.
Let's have one more question and then call it a day. Who has been selected? Hi. Hi.
I just wanted to make a brief comment. We heard a lot about the Meadow, and those of us who came early, throughout my entire career here of 40 years, every day on campus, I bicycled with Peter Scott and others down the Meadow and admired the beauty of it from a bicycle. And the point I want to make is that it's always been a continuous struggle to maintain the beauty. Just to give you an example, when Stevenson was chancellor, you may remember, he wanted to build a highway through the Meadow. And it took an enormous effort, Peter Scott and others, to persuade the campus not to do this. This very building I think, is lower than it would have otherwise be. So what I want to say is that future generations have to keep an eye out, because there is a cheap way to build, and unless they are aware, the campus beauty might not be maintained.
Thank you. I really would like to underline that a great deal.
Before we thank Jim one more time, let me remind you, we have refreshments out in the lobby. So please consume a lot so the chancellor will provide money for our next.
Do your duty.